Love them or hate them, or fall anywhere on the long z-axis of ambivalence if you're fancy, the Homestuck epilogues and Homestuck Squared unquestionably exist. They are there. Anytime we create fan work with relevance to Homestuck, it is in some way informed by a world in which these officialized post-canon works are a thing. They can't stop being a thing, and completely ignoring the elephant in the room will only take you so far when it comes to post-canon works of your own. It's disingenuous to say that they aren't there, because they are. I spent kind of a lot of time thinking about the best way, procedurally, to approach this topic. There are as many opinions about the epilogues and Homestuck Squared as there are people who have read them, and anyone watching this is coming from a radically different perspective with regard to writing, too. My mission statement, as it were, is more practical than philosophical. I want to read more post-canon fic. I enjoy post-canon fic. The vast majority of what I write is either post-canon or a diegetic pirate musical sequel. I want you to walk away from this presentation ready to write, or at least think very seriously about writing your take on post-canon. I do consider canon to be Homestuck itself, and the epilogues / Homestuck Squared to be something different, but equally relevant due to their officiality and widely read and commented on status, but that's a subject for a different video. For now, here's where we are, or where I'm presuming you are. You might like to make post-canon art, especially but not necessarily fiction writing ways, except you're not sure where to start, or you had an idea but scrapped it when Homestuck Squared was released, or you had an idea but didn't think it was worth pursuing in general. Here are your materials under the status quo. You have Homestuck, the associated fandom full of resources that may or may not be easily navigated, the epilogues, and Homestuck Squared. What will you do? That question is usually answered in roughly the same way as the similar question, what can you do? What do you have the tools to accomplish? By the end of this presentation, I hope that you will have at least 2 or 3 new tactics to address the challenge of creating writing-y fan art for a concept still actively evolving, very much outside of the hands of the majority of the fandom. That kind of is the challenge, right? After the epilogues were released, an influx of continuations, alt versus art, comics, writing, a whole cornucopia of post-canon fanworks flooded archives and tags for months. A number of these were abandoned or quickly finished in light of the addition of Homestuck Squared as an officialized continuation. It represents a very different kind of philosophical challenge, writing about something that is still unfinished, actively evolving, and written week to week, month to month, by different people. However, some of the tactics that served artists well in the aftermath of the epilogues can be just as effective now as they were a little over a year ago, despite the changing aesthetic scenery and the difficulty of engaging with a fairly slippery and malleable work. There are 3 main trends of engagement with the epilogues that can also extend really productively to Homestuck Squared: outright rejection, continuation, and integration. Let's start off by thinking about what these looked like for the epilogues. Some works very explicitly reject the epilogues and actively trade on the fact that others similarly are looking for disengagement points. Out of the 157 works tagged not epilogue compliant on Archive of Our Own, only 10 were published prior to the release of the prologue on April 13th, 2019, prior to which I understand that the credits were considered the epilogue. Popular means of executing this include subverting the initial conversation with Rose, a different food choice at a picnic, or simply ignoring the Lord English conflict presented altogether and getting right to the good stuff, whatever each specific writer considered the good stuff not present in the epilogues to be. It's no coincidence that the third most common additional tag on top of not epilogue compliant is fluff, the others being descriptive tags like post-canon that can more or less be assumed from the need to distance themselves from the epilogues. Yes, Homestuck writers produce a lot of fluff by volume. It's the most common additional tag on all Homestuck fan work combined, but it's always been something missing from Homestuck proper. Fluff gratification is a pretty straightforward kind of gratification to write and read and digest. What people did here, often with great success, was simply recognize what they didn't like about the epilogues and write that instead. It's a legitimate and effective way to write. Anytime you experience something that leaves a bad taste in your mouth or leaves you wanting something more, that's an important cue for your enjoyment of art. Either you're tapping into something that someone else feels just as strongly about, or you're experiencing something novel and interesting, and either way, emotions about a story make potent fodder for exploration. Saying, this is where this fell short, for me, this is how it made me feel as opposed to the way I want to feel when reading this sort of thing, is a first step to reverse engineering what you do want to accomplish with a piece of art. Maybe you just wanted fan trolls on Earthsea exploring the culture. Maybe you just wanted fluff. Maybe you wanted to see the characters do something different, succeed in a specific way that it was hard to see them fail. Maybe you would have liked Dave Cat to be kissing from the beginning, or for the story to focus more on transgender narratives, or lesbian domestic bliss narratives. Or you think that the mayor should have still been alive, so every story beat without him present is pretty bullshit. This is a reaction to the epilogue, so it's still a relationship with them. Saying, no, actually, I want something different, is a way of defining where you stand in relation to what they say about Homestuck, about the potential of the characters, about epilogues in general, and stories, and family, and love, and forgiveness, and addiction, and, well, you know. To reject something, you have to recognize it first, or sincerely believe that you do. Next up, continuation. This follows pretty logically, and literally it follows the story to which it relates. The opposite of rejection, continuation is an acceptance of the events in the epilogues. It says, here's where you left off, and here's what I think might happen next. Especially for the epilogues, this was made very straightforward. Loose ends were left untied beneath neon orange headache-inducing text that said, loose ends here, won't someone heroically pick them up and then come chop off my head? Jumping off points abounded, the spaceship pursuit, the dynamic of life on the spaceship itself, the metaphysics of Rose's ascension, whatever was going on with Davebot, the reappearance of Vriska in the Candyverse, the Candy Kids. There's a lot to go on, even if only a few of those or just one option catches your eye. Hundreds of little hat tips to Earthsea culture and affairs in Paradox space to extend and enrich the universe into a fresh piece of fan art. Acceptance is a theme here. To write a rote continuation, one really has to trust that their assessment of the work was complete and comprehensive enough to sustain a story that will satisfy them. I've written straight-up sequels, including to the epilogues, with the goal of expanding without contradicting, and it can be a challenging line to walk, but the constraints of an existing universe can really help to direct the vicarious creative energy that sloughs off any enjoyable work of media. One kind of has to like a story, at least on some level, to continue it, to sincerely believe that there is something worth defibrillator or paddling the story back to life to keep telling. Finally, since holy fucking shit do I love organizing things into threes, there's integration. True to the thesis, antithesis, synthesis shtick I love so fondly, to integrate an additional level of story into another story requires nuance in both acceptance and rejection. There are inherent constraints to telling any kind of story. Homestuck itself fundamentally can't be a limitless fluff fest for every character. That would be unwritable and virtually unreadable. Homestuck proper is already a behemoth, and allocating an additional few thousand words of happy domesticity to each character's story drastically compromises the momentum of the plot, and also requires a prohibitive amount of work and a prohibitive amount of reading to consume. Every work's balance between audience gratification and forward momentum to a conclusion is going to be different, and different sorts of work can sustain different levels of balance. Homestuck would not be Homestuck if it was critically different in terms of this balance, whether you like that or not in terms of what it says about the work. So one way to integrate a work into another work is to accept that what was written is what happened, but isn't all that happened. The Homestuck epilogues are particularly rife with opportunities for this. They are told about a large cast of characters from the limited perspectives of, mostly, Dirk and John. When John leaves a room, we stop seeing what happens in that room. When John doesn't understand something, we also are not spoon-fed an understanding of that thing. A lot of story happens in the background. Accepting a text doesn't mean taking it at face value. The epilogues are incredibly literal about narrator unreliability. They are not just on the nose about this, they are knuckle-deep in septal cartilage. They are so ham-fisted that kosher kitchens across the nation have them on a do-not-permit entry list. There is a whole-ass page towards the end of Candy exploring the ways that narration and the written word obscure objective truth and elucidate subjective truth, the truth of who the narrator is and what they want to believe or to convince others to believe rather than what is happening and what has happened. Altogether, this makes fantastic fodder for expansive works based on the epilogues. Dirk as a narrator lies by omission to match both his self-perception and his objective, to be comprehended as incomprehensible, as beyond redemption, as a mad dog immune to reason that has to be put down. To understand all is to forgive all, and he does not want to be forgiven. John straight up has not been present for a few years, and much of that narration is based on conjecture, willful ignorance, and the reasoning of someone mired in debilitating depression. See, a few seconds ago, R.E. Dirk. There's a lot of room to take the words of the epilogues and accept them, but then to go on and contextualize them, to re-understand them, to fortify their meaning without extrapolating forward to something new. At its basest level, this evokes missing scenes, bridges between events, exploration of rationale for events, recontextualization of what narratively is without deliberately contradicting it. I've written all of these. Rejection, when I do it, looks like magnesium ion porphyrin ring, in which I rehash Jake's entire timeline to examine what it would take to get him to a good end on Earthsea, how the epilogues could be averted, and how similar that might look to how things actually were. Continuation looks like the grand battement of the learned, picking up where the epilogues left off, with Rose grappling with incomplete ascension and a wealth of knowledge, none of which seems to matter. Integration looks like Bad Love's Company, with each chapter paired with a page of Candy, examining the extent of Candy John's inadvertent influence on Candy, in parallel with Dirk's deliberate ransacking of Meat, and what it means for them to be foils, and what it could mean for them to heal. All that to say, no approach is inherently wrong. It isn't right or wrong to reject the epilogues, to hate them, to refuse to read them, to love them, to embrace them as canon straight from the mouth of God. I mean, the last one strikes me as a little self-contradictory when the recently necromancied back-to-life authored god figure writes an essay aggressively affirming there not being a chapter 51 of Homestuck. But any way you think, any way you write, is valuable and important. If no one else has said that to you today, let me say it right now. Thinking, writing, and creating are beautiful and good things to do. Anything you make has value. It is an affirmation of your humanity, and always a step on to something greater. Regardless of how you feel about the epilogues, I hope you find inspiration in or from them. If you make something you otherwise would not have made, the whole thing was worth it. Alright, so that's the framework. Next question, and also the main question to be answered. Why is it so hard to make that work for Homestuck Squared? How is the present state for fanwork creators different from the state prior to Homestuck Squared dropping? And the meat? Of the video essay, what factors make it easier or harder to write post-canon fanwork, and what can we do to nudge the dynamic towards easy and inviting rather than difficult and prohibitive? I lied. That is not one question, that is a lot of questions, but they all have a lot to do with each other, right? And it's worth noting here that I'm not just talking about making it easier for you to write. We are all the fandom, and no matter how weird and sometimes powerless a designation that can be, you are never entirely alone when you are trying to enjoy something. Everyone else here is trying to enjoy things too. I promise. So what's different? What changed the playing field? Let me rattle off some bullet points because, perhaps fortunately, this video has a time limit. Homestuck Squared is not complete. It's not clearly defined in purpose. It trades, thus far, on subversion of expectations with a guaranteed long wait for a potential payoff on fan theories. It takes the place of many fanworks looking to deal in continuation, and with much higher production value and wider reach than most people with jobs or studies and without wide name recognition can accomplish alone. It's a bi-monthly spoonful of controversy and discussion rather than a several-month firestorm. Some components are behind a paywall. It requires long-term time and energy investment to follow as opposed to the epilogues, which were comparatively low-cost in terms of long-term demand on your time/attention if you didn't like them but wanted to understand the fuss anyway. I hope that's enough to define the scope of what we're working with here. I can't claim that Homestuck Squared had a drastic interfering effect on my ongoing fanworks. Stuff that I'm taking a break on is stuff that I was going to take a break on anyway. I am really dedicated to finishing this anonymously published pirate musical sequel. I got a cool new job, and then society disintegrated even further than the status quo, so I've been working from home since March. Stuff happens, and sometimes it's hard to pinpoint exactly what changed other than new officialized fanwork on the horizon, much more visually appealing than yours. But two things. I've talked with people who felt very strongly about Homestuck Squared's abortive influence on their post-canon work, and it's definitely changed the fandom landscape and changed where my priorities are in terms of writing, which has changed the way I look at my epilogue continuation in particular. It feels less urgent, when someone else is doing one that's so much shinier, which may not be a sentiment that flatters me, but it's the truth. So let's treat Homestuck Squared ennui as a phenomenon that, for at least one of the reasons I just listed, exists. I am interested in the takes of anyone watching, so please don't be shy about commenting on this or any subject if you feel either different or the same. In light of those confounding variables, though, how do we reject something that isn't even close to finished yet? How do we continue something that is self-continuing? How do we integrate a work into existing work when we're not sure if the answers and rationale we might supply will be contradicted in a week or two and will look foolish for having been wrong? Fear of looking foolish is a particularly real one here. I feel like an idiot sometimes speculating about Homestuck Squared. I don't have the vast wealth of fandom knowledge that some people, including the writers of Homestuck Squared, possess. I read Homestuck for the first time after the epilogues dropped, and I felt like I've been playing catch-up ever since. But even if you avidly followed Homestuck back in the day, perhaps especially if you considered your grasp on the lore steel, solid, and airtight, odds are good that you've had the rug pulled out from you more than once in the process of reading these officialized post-canon works. And if you were wrong about those things, well, couldn't you be wrong now? It fucking sucks to feel wrong about something you care about. Categorically, that experience sucks shit. The other main problem there is the lack of a clear starting point, and the obfuscation of what previously seemed like clear starting points. Let's address both of those. The two birds, one stone approach is to reevaluate our relationship with both the epilogues and Homestuck Squared. I'm not getting into the weeds here yet, but I'm really adamant that both the healthiest and the most accurate way to regard both is as pure fanworks. Quite simply, neither actually changes the text of Homestuck. Neither claims to change the text of Homestuck, which is good because it would be a false claim if it were made. Homestuck is still there. It's still the canon, as in the authoritative scripture. The word canon comes from the Greek kanon for a measuring stick, a rule, a standard, a defined area. What is our measuring stick for the epilogues? When we look for deviations from expectation and conformity to expectation, what sets those expectations? It's Homestuck. I swear to God, that's a video/essay I'm working on. In the meantime, though, I understand that insisting someone just accept that it's a pure fan work is a little like insisting someone just stop disliking the texture of raw tomato innards. Like, sure, that would be great. But how? Some actionable ways to do this. Seek out high production value fanworks other than the epilogues. Immerse yourself in the plotty fanwork of others. Remind yourself that there are sincerely other ways the story could go. Like, if you feel boxed in by the epilogues or Homestuck Squared, I am challenging you right now to poke around on Twitter or MS Paint Adventures, to put out a request on Reddit, or whatever means you choose, and dip your toe in 5 different post-canon works that wind up feeling real enough to you. DM me on Twitter and tell me what sort of stuff you like. I have loads of recommendations. Kitty Quest, Jade Route, 413AC, Act Omega, a metric shit ton of cool fanfics. I'm not going to directly plug my own work, but I think it's pretty good. Remind yourself that there is more than one way these stories can go, and still feel similarly connected with Homestuck. The stuff we read really influences what we feel like we can create, and if the main thing you're consuming is Homestuck Squared, well, that's a really complicated thing to treat as your personal benchmark. Reevaluate your relationship with creating fan work by contextualizing it within other works. You might find something you really vibe with, or even if you don't, you might just realize that other people are reading and writing and enjoying post-canon stuff that isn't married to Homestuck Squared or the epilogues, that doesn't take a coordinated team of writers and artists to accomplish. And if they can do it, you can do it. And you can do it better, or at least more in fulfillment of what you want out of Homestuck fanworks. You can also influence the creation of more fanwork of the sort that you enjoy and that inspires you. The more you're supporting people who create stuff you like, the more stuff you like there will be. You can't punish or guilt people into making art to your tastes, but support, comments, constructive friendships, sharing works you like with other people who you're sure will like them. It matters, and it creates an environment where stuff you like, including, presumably, the stuff you make, can flourish. Participating in a community rather than writing solo can really lessen the blow of being wrong. People can and do still care about epilogues rationalization, continuation, and rejection, even with Homestuck Squared happening. These starting points in the epilogues, all those we went over, all of them still exist. The text of the epilogues was not changed through the addition of Homestuck Squared either. But if you want to write about Homestuck Squared specifically, whether you want to reject it or augment it or continue it in your own direction or whatever, a lot of what makes epilogue-related fics work does apply here. Number 1. Have an idea. It seems perhaps overly basic, but recognizing what interests you and then letting the idea gestate is a vital part of the process. Identify something you feel about the text, something you want from the text, some unsated desire or unanswered question, then dwell on it for a little. Really, think about what you want. If you want to reject the epilogues, reject Homestuck Squared, whatever, what specifically grinds your gears? What would it take to fix that? What kind of story doesn't produce the negative reaction you associate with these officialized post-canon works? I usually have a whole idea research phase where I deep dive into media, essays, and Homestuck proper itself, trying to figure out why I want to write what I want to write, why I feel how I feel. This is abundantly worth doing. Number 2. Have a sense of scope. Some ideas fuel 300,000-word pirate musicals. Some ideas fuel 100-word drabbles. You don't need to sustain a novel for an idea to be worth exploring. In fact, in my readings, it seems like many rejection of the epilogues fics are kneecapped by a deficit in sense of their scope. Some ideas will only take you through a few hundred words before you run out of steam, and if you plan in advance for this, really think about what you're trying to accomplish, what narrative beats you want to hit, what you mean by this work, you can nip the 2 chapters published out of ? Last updated 3 years ago struggle in the bud. Number 3. Have a sense of yourself as a writer. I know that I tend to spiral off on digressions, that I physically can't stop writing once I get started, that my chapters tend to get much longer as I go, that I hate editing, that I get wildly carried away with my projects. Know who you are, or try to know who you are, and what might get in the way of accomplishing the tidy, picture-perfect narrative you're envisioning. Know your faults, and then forgive yourself for them. What you are doing is good and beautiful. 50 words that took you 3 months to write is 50 fucking words. And that's not nothing. An idea that never leaves your brain is not nothing. A chapter with a small army of typos that you don't catch until 3 days later is not nothing. All of these change you. All of these are accomplishments. Any time that you are creating something, working your way through something, you are growing into the person you need to be to make the next thing. Number 4. Have a sense of your source material. I've reread both epilogues in their entirety at least 10 times at this point in my life. You are under no obligation to do this to yourself. However, if you're writing about the epilogues, whether to reject them or to accept them or to transmute them, it's useful to reread them. Find a way that makes it more tolerable if reading them is prohibitive for whatever reason. A let's read on YouTube, your friends reading them aloud with you and joking about them over Discord, whatever. If you can't bear to refer back to the work you're referencing, that's going to box you in pretty debilitatingly. Part of having a sense of your source material is considering if it's going to be harmful for you to reference it. Hurting yourself to make art just isn't worth the price tag. Sometimes rejecting the epilogues means not writing about them at all and finding a departure point long before they happened. Number 5. Let yourself grow. You don't have to be wedded to a consistent medium, style, approach, fanfic. If it's not working, if it's not a joyful endeavor, it's okay to stop. It's okay to change. It's okay to go back and rewrite your first chapter completely because you wrote it 3 months ago and you've evolved so much as a writer that you can't bear to look at it anymore and it's weighing you down like an albatross around your neck. Retcon that shit. Change everything. Abandon what isn't enjoyable. You can come back later, or never. Shame and guilt are not useful. Recognizing this, you can help your friends as well as, if not more than, yourself. As a fan artist, you owe the fandom jack fucking squat. If it helps to imagine that you do, no shame in that either. But my immutable rule for enjoying a hobby is to keep an inventory of whether you are actually enjoying it or not. And if you are not, and if there is no clear way to change that enjoyment quotient, hit the bricks. Life is so short, and so many things about existence are miserable. Your art should not make you miserable. Since Homestuck Squared has been a thing, I've written about 400,000 words of fanfiction. Some of that has been about Homestuck Squared, including a sane continuation of that one Terezi Rosebot moment and a Spaceship of Theseus fic. Some have been about the epilogues, my ongoing continuation fic and its sequels/spin-offs, the complacency of the fucked, and a eulogy for Laplace's demon. One is a class-spec inverted kid swap with nothing to do with either. I wrote a series that I call Dirk and Jake Trailspin into the Epilogues, which is exactly what it sounds like. Me saying, here's what happened. Like Adrian Monk at the end of an episode of the fantastic detective show Monk, except what happened is like a 40,000 word post-mortem of their relationship. I've written a totally unrelated Jake Vriska friendship commercial fishing AU. I have written so fucking much of the aforementioned pirate musical, which has nothing and also everything to do with the epilogues. A common thread. I know what I like, and what will motivate me to keep writing. I love protracted narrative meditations on character. I love zany hijinks, plot bullshit that somehow winds up taking a backstage to interpersonal development, and dear lord do I love Jake and Rose. They are my favourite characters. I loved the epilogues, and I think Homestuck Squared is pretty fun. This is part of knowing yourself, too. So how do you write a rejection of Homestuck Squared? Understanding what you like to write about, find a point of departure with it. This will likely be in the epilogues, but maybe not. Maybe you just think Crazy's wallet corpse is ridiculous, or you truly can't stand the soap opera shenanigans in the Candy timeline, or you think what the world truly needs is an apocrypha of Rose Resi Kismesis without Dirk around to spoil the fun. Legitimately, I'm in for all of that. Figure out why what is triggers your rejection instinct, and then work your way to something that doesn't, that fulfills the part of you that was left wanting by the text. If the next update contradicts you, read it, process it, and either integrate that into your story or reject that too. It's your city now. How about a continuation? In the midst of the summer hiatus, this is still pretty easy to do. Look at where we left off. Candy Carket introduced, sort of. The Candy Kids, Yiffany's situation, Rose's frenetic species invention, Dirk Resi Black Diamond friendship. A deep dive into the ongoing implication of Vriska and Vrissy in light of the Vriska debacle. This is just off the top of my head. Pick a point, mull it over until you know whether you've got is a short character meditation, a chapter fic, a few drabbles smushed together, and then get cracking. If it's going to be disruptive when Homestuck Squared starts to update again, pick a format that you can burn through fairly quickly. Know yourself, compensate for it, and know that it's okay if it doesn't work for whatever reason. Finally, an integration. We've missed a lot of shit on the spaceship, in the Candy Kids backgrounds, in the procedural way all that fucked up shit could have gone down in Candy. This may require more digging, reading, and thinking, but that's always been the point of integration type stories, picking up on cues in the text that make you think, and interpreting them for yourself in a way that you can walk others through your proposed interpretation without writing an essay about it. Show us Calliope writing their fanfic on the walls, Alt Callie being spurned by Jade and writing her into an illicit affair with Rose to prove she's not above manipulation herself, Dirk twisting the Candy timeline, June's retcon powers seeping back in with the addition of Vriska's relevance, the text messages between Vriska and Trezzy off in the Meat timeline. Again, I'm just spitballing, but you see what I mean? It can be done. I know I need to stop monologuing and take questions soon, so feel free to ask about any of this or anything I've written or basically whatever. I'm linking a live stream below, or you can just click back to my channel and it should be there. I'm recording this long before the actual date, so fuck me if I know how any of this works. Thanks so much for watching, and if you don't stick around with me for the Q&A, enjoy the rest of Stay at Home Con or SACon.